Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We had a little bit of a late start. People are still coming in, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. Just a note that live captioning is available. Please send a message in the chat in case you need assistance in enabling it. I'd like to start by thanking the Toronto Biennial of Art for co-presenting today's forum conversation between Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Tina Sherwell, as well as TD Bank Group for supporting our 2021-22 online engagements. My name is Amna Muzaffar and I'm the Assistant Curator at Mercer Union. I'm joining you today from Toronto, where I've come to reside as an uninvited guest on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And as we're meeting online, I ask that you take a moment to acknowledge the rightful stewards of the land in which you are situated. Today's forum is an accompaniment to the current exhibition at Mercer Union by Lawrence Abu Hamdan titled 45th Parallel. This ambitious film and installation commission is collaboratively developed with the Toronto Biennial of Art and is co-curated by the Biennial's Tyrone Bastian and Mercer Union's Julia Powley. As a project that has developed over many years of dialogue between the artist and countless collaborators and partners, it's a truly special achievement to finally share Lawrence's film with our publics near and far, and to extend on that today with a deeper dive and critical reflection on the themes and questions at the center of this exhibition. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Lawrence Abu Hamdan is a private ear born in Amman, Jordan. His interest in sound and politics originates from a background as a touring musician and facilitator of DIY music. His audio investigations have been used as evidence at the UK Asylum and Immigration Tribunal and as advocacy for organizations such as Amnesty International. Lawrence has exhibited at the 58th Venice Biennial, the 13th and 14th Sharjah Biennial, the 11th Gwangju Biennial, and Tate Modern in London. As part of a temporary collective with nominated artists Helen Kamak, Oscar Murillo, and Ty Shani, he was awarded the 2019 Turner Prize. Joining Lawrence in conversation is Tina Sherwell, visiting professor of art and art history at NYU Abu Dhabi. From 2017 to 2021, she was the head of contemporary visual art at Birzeit University, prior to which she was director of the International Academy of Art in Palestine. She has authored various texts on contemporary Palestinian art and in 2019 curated the major exhibition, Intimate Terrains, Representations of a Disappearing Landscape at the Palestine Museum in Birzeit. Tina is also the author of A Pair of Boots, the critical essay accompanying Lawrence's exhibition at Mercer Union. Following their discussion, Tyrone Bastian will join us to moderate an expanded discussion and Q&A, so hold on to your questions as they come up. And let's begin today's forum. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Tina Sherwell. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone, Amna and Julia and Beatrice and everybody at Mercer Union. Thank you, Tyrone and Tyrone Bastian and everyone at Toronto Biennial too. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the collaboration. And yeah.
Okay, so we'll get started to discuss this fantastic new film that you've done, Lawrence. In the 45th Parallel, you use the site of the library and the Opera House to explore how seemingly disparate spaces are implicated within each other, and how presumably sterile and mundane non-spaces of borders are in fact deeply layered sites in which questions of visibility, invisibility, and fields of vision have fatal consequences. I wonder if you could speak to the question of the space of the library and border spaces.
Yeah, I mean, for those who haven't seen the work, it's a portrait of a library that's also an opera house. So the ground floor is a library, and the first floor is an opera house. And so it's not that it's just a random kind of place. In the film, I'm kind of playing with that strange discrepancy between the two functions of the site. And it's, you know, it feels like an awkward jump into a parallel world when we enter the opera house, and that's kind of intentional. It's also how you feel when you go there, because downstairs is this very kind of mundane library. I mean, the building is kind of nice-ish, old, turn of the century building, if that's your kind of thing. It's not really my kind of thing, but it's, you know, it's all right. The weird thing about the building is it has this line, oh, that you just saw, cutting through it, which is in fact the U.S. Border, U.S.-Canadian border. And it was actually built on purpose to straddle that borderline. And at the time of its building, it was a symbolic act, because it was built in 1904 by this Haskell family. And it was a symbolic act to just, you know, make a kind of gesture. There's the border sort of going through. So it's demarcated by electrical tape, actually. What did I want to say? So yeah, you're in this site of dual jurisdiction. So though the borderline actually cuts through the building, and in the opera house, absurdly, it actually cuts the audience from the stage. So the stage is in Canada and the audience are in the US. Though kind of de jure that's the case, actually de facto, once you're inside the building, it's like the border doesn't exist. So you can really have entered from the same door from Canada and the US. It's not like it has two different doors. You both enter from the same door, but from different sides. The US kind of cross the road, and Canadians enter from the sidewalk. Even though the door is technically in the US, anyone can enter, and once inside, there is no kind of, I mean, you're crossing the border all the time when you're looking and browsing the books, or when you're moving through the stalls in the theater, but you are, you know, crossing a symbolic line. So it is interesting, this idea that, you know, at one point this was simply symbolic, that this was a gesture between kind of like communities who were friendly, where borders were seemingly decided in a very different kind of context than they are today. And then, of course, post 9/11, the building suddenly becomes under siege. Now, I think technically they can't change the context of the building because of agreements they have when they actually form the border itself. So they can't really change the use of this building, or they may have to like give back Alaska or something, right? So there's some like stakes involved in keeping this a dual jurisdiction site. Even though, of course, it's not a desirable, you know, kind of symbolic act anymore in this sort of contemporary landscape post 9/11. But I mean, whatever, borders have been stiffening, whether or not that was the kind of catalyst. So, so this building is really kind of under siege. You have a US border guard outside all the time with the engine running, just idling his car, moves a little bit from here to there, I guess. I don't know why, but you see him sort of triangulate around the building, but most of the time very close, just outside. And of course, they're looking at who's going in and using that space. And the space itself, you know, has moved from something symbolic to functional. I mean, it's functional on the one hand that it's a functioning library. It's and functioning in a kind of extremely mundane way. In fact, I mean, it's just like a sort of banal, run-of-the-mill lending library with not such a great collection of books. Sorry if anyone from Haskell is listening. But you know, that's also what really attracted me to the site, because it was in one way extremely exceptional, and the other way extremely kind of mundane. And I think those kind of sites and those kind of stories are really good at sort of allowing us access to quite sort of complicated, embodied political and sort of political violence in many ways, we could say. So I'm very much attracted to those kinds of sites anyway. And so I loved it that when I first went there on a site visit with Tyrone, actually, we walked in, there was, people, we were kind of like mesmerized by this line going through the space. And there was like someone behind us, and he was clearly just like a sort of regular user of the library. And he kind of like, shush, just get out the way kind of thing, you tourists coming to see that stupid line, just let me get my books off. And so immediately that kind of tension was there between the kind of mundane and the exceptional. I mean, it enacted itself as soon as we walked in the space.
It's such an anomaly. It's such an anomaly, that's right, because when you're speaking about it being really of kind of being porous, and then how now borders have become so kind of concrete and so defined, and the regularities and regulations around them, and this being this kind of symbolic gesture. It's almost so hard to imagine borders in that way after all that we've been experiencing in the last.
Exactly, yeah. In that sense, it is an anomaly, and I think even what's sad is that I think even libraries are increasingly anomalous spaces in general, and I think that's also what I was interested in part in telling this story, because they're also under siege in general. I mean, in the UK, in the context which I know best, that was the first thing to be annihilated in the first conservative kind of austerity measures. The first thing was just libraries everywhere shutting down. And I don't think it's a coincidence, right? That those are the places where the belt is tight, because they are inherently anti-capitalist kind of spaces, whether they are explicitly that or not. They're places where there's free exchange of knowledge, free exchange of, materials and books without any kind of necessity to buy, spaces where you can spend hours without necessity to consume. They've become more, the only real libraries that survived were the ones where actually they adapted to some kind of like necessity to consume, and they had like cafes, and they sort of whatever. But so I think that was also interesting for me, that it wasn't just about the free space that has been sort of kind of that is under, that space is not also under siege, but also sort of like that place and those ideas with it, the kind of idea of the free library. It all seemed kind of increasingly anachronistic, butting against a contemporary that was quite brutal. And so, yeah, I think these are all the reasons why I ended up there. Plus, of course, the stories that I knew going there, which was, so we went after the Muslim ban. When this library had a very functional use. In fact, it was a place where, let's say, you couldn't get a US visa because you're from Sudan or Iran or Somalia or wherever, and not wherever, but 12 countries that were banned by Trump. But let's say you had relatives inside or friends inside, or you wanted to see someone or meet someone or have a meeting, a business meeting, whatever you wanted to do, right? Became impossible. So people would meet in this library, because let's say you're from Somalia or Iran, and you are living in because this place, I must say now, is more known. The Haskell Free Library is more known in Tehran than it is in Canada, right? When I presented this film in Canada, more people who were like, I've never heard of this place, I've never seen it, I never thought. But when you talk to Iranians and you go to Tehran, everyone's like, oh yeah, that library, the one that is useful right now. So essentially, because, you know, if you can't leave because you won't be let back in, let's say you have an Iranian passport, you're living in the US, you can't leave because you're worried you don't get let back in. You then don't want to leave the US. So the only way to meet people is if they can get a Canadian visa and you can both meet in this library in the middle of nowhere. And so the first thing you come across are these big no eating signs. And yeah, and that was a kind of measure the library had to put in place to explain to us on the first site visit that essentially, you know, it was becoming sort of difficult for them to manage because, of course, there were these big kind of family gatherings and stuff, and people bringing food through, and yeah, so that they were also kind of clinging on to the libraries as a sort of space that was also about kind of books and learning and, you know, and exchange of knowledge and literature over this other thing that it was becoming because of this kind of spatial and legal anomaly that the building was. So there was this kind of struggle, and that's what the last line in the film is about, where it's a quote from one of the librarians who says, yeah, I mean, okay, don't eat, but, you know, I can't say don't talk because, you know, famously you don't talk in libraries, but we had to make an exception because I don't want to shush you when you haven't seen your grandmother in forever, she said. So it seemed to me that it was this sort of very unlikely space which was dealing with a lot of these kind of geopolitical conditions. And yeah.
It really speaks to like the inventiveness of people, particularly caught in these kind of rubrics of the you know, of fortress cultures of nation states and the questions of borders, but the way in which people are so inventive to try and find solutions in these kind of border spaces. And you've also got this coming up in your other works, such as this whole time there were no landmines. So this idea of how people kind of then, how they're inventive, you know, in border spaces.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's a really good point, Tina. And I think there is something of a shared sort of portrait that's going on between those two works of sort of border sites. But I don't think it's this sort of inventiveness. It's more about, I mean, that's a really great point, but I would say what was really important for me in the kind of Shouting Valley area, which is the area of the sort of occupied Golan Heights between annexed from Syria in 1967 by Israel, and basically families gathering on either side of a valley and kind of communicating across to one another. What was really important to me about that story was not that people were shouting to each other and it was like a space of liberation against the border. What was really interesting for me is that in 2011, when there was an uprising in Syria, and that border was in fact breached, right, by Syrian Palestinian protesters, Palestinians living in Syria. When that border, known for its kind of continual breaching, known for the continual transfer of the voice, right, across its path. So it was there because it had this kind of symbolic meaning as a place that was being transgressed. Yet when those people came there to breach the border, right, who were not part of those divided communities, they broke it down. They broke the border down. And what were those voices on both sides of the border doing when they were breaking it down? They were telling them, stop, right? They weren't telling them, go, yeah, let's break the border. They were telling them, stop. So you understood that at that moment that the voice that was crossing the border, it created a kind of fissure, right? That eventually kind of cracked the border open. But actually, it was also supporting the border. It was fluid enough, and that it was actually, and at some point, kind of maintaining a kind of status quo, and actually setting that border in its own way. And I found that really important. It was doing both those things. It was both breaking the border and really kind of sedimenting it. And I think, you know, and that spoke to me much more about how complicated it is to live in those communities and to exist in those spaces, more than just the idea of a kind of liberating shriek across the border, a salutation. And I think that's the same thing that's going on here, right? It's like, it is this, but it's also not, you know, it's, I think I'm really attracted to the way, that these spaces where the cracks are, right? And, you know, and aware that those cracks are sometimes not really as they seem, and they can be also, you know, yeah, you know, they can really quickly invert themselves. And in fact, if I may tell the story a little bit of the film, behind the scenes of making this film. When we were making the film, we were very encouraged by the staff to make that film. They had come off the Muslim ban. They were very much interested in telling the story that was going on in the library. But there was a kind of change of hands, and they became quite hostile to us making this film, actually, in the end, and telling this story, and insisting that they didn't want anyone to know about the space, and putting on the website, no cross-border meetings allowed, right? And so, of course, they couldn't really enforce that, because how can you? But there was a way in which this place as well was becoming increasingly hostile to its own kind of story, and sort of, yeah, I don't know, yeah, sort of, yeah, I'm not really trying to make a direct analogy between those two things, but I think it is interesting to see how these spaces kind of open, contract, close, right, and just sort of,
and that they're not static. They're always in this transformation. They're always in these transformative states, from often in like quite short periods of time, that they'll be changing, and that the communities who use them also, we can't really lump them all together. It's not a case that it's the united front, as you were describing with the other work. It isn't that they're all on the kind of the same side and are all for this, as we said, yes, go liberate. It isn't that case at all. That, you know, with communities in this situation, there are multiple positions there too. So
exactly.
As you said, those cracks are really intriguing, and their temporality as well. As you said, just kind of changing in the course of you making the film.
Yeah, and also I think, you know, another connection between those two works is that there is this sort of, you know, line, there's a threshold between the kind of symbolic and the real that keeps getting kind of pushed up against, right? Like, there's a moment when, in order to stop those protesters breaking down the border, the divided communities are shouting, "Fi al-Gham, there's landmines," right? And in fact, so this whole time they were sitting away from each other shouting, thinking that there was this kind of like explosive force between them, right? The line, the borderline was ready to blow, right? Should they cross with anything but their voice? And yet when these people came over and just kind of crossed, there was no landmines, right? So you're kind of waiting for this explosion when they're shouting there's mines. And in fact, there wasn't. And so it is also about the sort of imagination of the border, the kind of embodied violence of it, right?
And it becomes mythic. It becomes mythic.
Yeah.
And then actually, when you get to borders, they're actually really not mundane, but they're also, I mean, they're mythic in their tensions that they have, but they're actually, if we look at their materiality in terms of often
they're absurd as well. I mean, that's the point. They're entirely absurd, right? So I mean, they're both, and I find it hard to find another example of something that's so absurd and so lethal at the same time, you know? Maybe there are many others and people will know them, but I think when you're in that site and in that film, that's really what I was trying to access, right? That it's entirely absurd that there's a line going through this building that is supposed to signify the distinction between two kind of nations. I mean, you know, we can go on, but it's also, the absurdity is what makes it also so much more brutal, actually, in a way. when you start understanding what these lines are capable of. So it's not that it's impossible that that place could just explode in landmines, right? In fact, we expect it. And that's why it doesn't need landmines, right? And so this whole kind of relation between the kind of symbolic and the sort of brutally real is also very much a story I wanted to tell around these sites, because I do think that's really what's characteristic of the violence, rather than them just being lines, right? It's all of these things happening at once, and then playing out in these different spaces. And in one of the stories I'm telling in this film, you know, it's no different. The story of the Mercer Hernandez case, where U.S. border agent shoots a Mexican teenager in the kind of sort of, you know, he's standing on the borderline, but the bullet crosses and shoots and kills Sergio Hernandez. Again, I mean, those were teenagers just playing. They were running up and down a culvert, right? That was entirely exposed.
Exactly. That kind of concrete space that was, you know, dried up because of the weather and the heat, and it would have been otherwise not a kind of a playground for them, and they were, you know, just, you know, hanging out, wasting time like all teenagers are in that kind of space. And then how it becomes absolutely fatal in that in that instant there.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like where you make your free space. And I think, playing on that line, you know, I think, was lethal, more lethal, I think, than even they expected. And I think, so yeah, I mean, that's the thing, that this film, for those who don't know, it becomes a kind of, this site in Haskell it's not just a portrait of that space, it's using that site and its symbolic and real and horrible and absurd potential to tell stories of other kind of such cross-border incidents. And yeah, so the bodies are kind of overlaid. Yeah.
While you were speaking, the backdrops have been passing, and they're really fascinating. The different backdrops you have in this piece, both in kind of a reference to theatrical space, but also the different viewpoints that you've chosen to have as the backdrops that you set for each act.
Yeah. So actually, I'm told, I don't know if this is true, but that the painter, the scene painter, is actually with us. So shout out to Elisa Simonel Keegan of Keegan's Mission Collective, who do backdrop painting for theater. Hi.
Yeah, they're just saying hi to us.
So I mean, it's fantastic to have you with us, and it'd be great to hear from you later. But I think, so these backdrops were an idea I had from when I went into, here they are. These are the painted ones that we commissioned for the shoot. But then there is existing one, which is Venice, which is in the Opera House. It's from, you know, it's historically been there, I think, since the beginning. I could be wrong about that. At least it's been there a long time, and it's continually restored. And it just was really crazy for me, I think, going into that theater, knowing that you're standing in US, looking at a stage in Canada, and then there's a scene of Venice, right? And that's what kind of got me into this sort of idea of the portal, or the kind of parallel worlds, or these kind of worlds that keep opening onto each other. And so in the film, I thought that a kind of scenographic device should be that these, like a kind of Russian doll, keep kind of opening up into each other. And that these, as the story unfolds, which is entirely connected. They're not like episodic. They're very kind of connected. Each scene, in a way, plays into each other, and the sort of space, the idea of the space would expand, right? That we'd go from this small library to sort of, cramped up on the edge of the stage with the backdrop there. And then, behind you is the concrete culvert, which kind of opens up the scene of the Mercer case. And then behind that is this kind of aerial view of Damascus, and we go wide with the cameras. And so this idea that as the case was unfolding and more people became implicated in it, and the border kept kind of becoming more and more complex and expanding, actually. So, I mean, in the story, when you watch the film, you understand that that Mercer's bullet, which crossed the U.S.-Mexican border, began to implicate all, in the Supreme Court, began to implicate all drone strikes in 7 or 8 different countries. So the cross-border killing of, I think, like 91,000 people started entering. And so this one Mexican teenager, Sergio Hernandez, started opening up into, thousands of cases. And that's why the Supreme Court had to shut it down, because in the end, they saw this kind of mountain of souls knocking at the US border, right? And that if they found the agent Mercer guilty, they would open themselves up to arbitration on and to deliberation on all these cross-border murders that they've been doing. So it was this sort of small story that they were trying to cast as a kind of what do you call that, lone wolf, kind of bad apple kind of agent. And then they started to realize, no, this is not a bad apple situation. This is US foreign policy that just kind of played out on a small scale. And then when it started to expand and echo into different spaces and cultures and times, so that was the sort of story I was trying to tell. And then in the end, there's this moment where they win that case on a 5-4 decision. And so the last act, we just shrink back into the library space, where we're kind of back into that one exception. There was a moment where if one vote on the Supreme Court had been different, we would be in the Haskell Free Library may not have been such an exceptional space that's kind of a fissure or a crack in the border, but there would be many more open up from the back of that case. And of course it doesn't. So I'm kind of explaining that because for those who haven't seen the film and so to understand the arc, should have said a really, spoiler alert.
It's really fantastic how those spaces open up through, the whole idea of the scenic, and how that's kind of been used in traditions of theater and used in painting, and how you go into that spaces alongside what is being narrated in the acts, and how you take us into these spaces, and then we, coming back into the library space. So it's actually it's incredible kind of movement, and as you said, how spaces collapse into each other and are very much kind of implicated with each other. Even in those kind of legalities. It also kind of brings up this issue of sight lines and visibility and the accuracy of vision, and really also the fatal consequences of human vision and, let's say, machine vision, particularly with the drone warfare and how you raise those issues. And so how that shooting on the border was implicated for drone warfare. So, with the sight lines of how scenes take you into spaces, like that image of kind of Venice, but then how also you have the, the vision of the drones, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that was what was important, and especially in telling also the case of Mercer versus Hernandez. I mean, it's one story, but I think if we think about that concrete culvert backdrop, and maybe one thing to ask the backdrop, the kind of scene painters there would be like, it was an awkward angle, right? And it wasn't the one that you would choose for that scene, and it was theatrical, but it was also like, it was an awkward sight line, right? It's like, I'm sure that when they were painting it, they were like, it would be so much better if this, But the fact is that, and Nabla Yahya is here also, so shout out to Nabla Yahya, who's head of all the production and research. What she painstakingly did is kind of map that sight line from the border, from where Agent Mercer would have stood, onto that scene of the concrete culvert, right? So what you're seeing is also exactly as he saw from that angle. So we kind of mapped 1-to-1, or as best we could, the borderline where he was and onto the backdrop where Sergio Hernandez was killed. So you have this sort of strange sort of scene that opens up into that space. That we use that border as a kind of 1-to-1 diagram to sort of analyze that killing and to understand it in space. And so it's literally one border is layered onto the other, and that does become a kind of sightline. And then, of course, that opens up into a hypothetical kind of drone image. And it's much more kind of a sigh of relief for the scene painters, who, you know, and why I say hypothetical is because the hypothetical was what entered the Supreme Court. They were like, what if, when we find this guy guilty, someone in Syria comes to us and say, but you killed this person, and that's the cross-border killing. And there's this whole thing about a very far-reaching bullet, right? So they say, first they dismiss it. They say, no, I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. They're kind of dancing around the subject, and they say, I don't know what you're talking about. It would have to be an extremely far-reaching bullet, right? As if like it was absurd that they're saying it could only ever apply to the US or Mexican border, or US or Canadian border, Mexican or Canadian border with the US, because that's where only something like this could ever happen, right? Where a bullet could cross the border and kill someone in another jurisdiction, but it's fired from the US. And they hadn't quite thought it through. So they sort of dismiss it by saying, well, that would be a very far-reaching bullet, forgetting that all these people are sitting in Arizona pulling the trigger in Syria or in Yemen or in Pakistan. So it's exactly the same condition, right? And so the kind of the defense of Mercer is slowly trying to get them to understand that, but he doesn't want to be too literal, in the case. It's kind of like, and then eventually, because they're not getting it, he says, "What if someone in Syria came and took us to court?" And it seemed to me that Syria was kind of cast almost as the kind of like place in the film of Aladdin. I don't know what it's called, that fucking city they say, it sort of felt to me it was like that. It could have been that city in Aladdin, right? It was just like anywhere in the Middle East. What if they come back to us, right? And so it also, I wanted also this kind of quite generic scene, which could be any one of these landscapes. And it was important for me to sort of play with that sort of generic or hypothetical sort of imagination that they had of this space that they were talking about.
Yeah, it's quite incredible when you think about kind of the way in which they defend those fatalities and the way they defend those kind of those fatal consequences of like border border police and of kind of drone warfare, as you mentioned, as you have in the script. And the ways in which they say that. I mean, you have in the film, it says Mercer claimed that he was surrounded by illegal aliens who threw rocks at him. Witness deny this, and there are no rocks visible in the video. Invisible rocks versus real bullets was a hard argument to win. And so the US Department of Justice developed a strategy in defense of the agent. They sought to make something so brutally simple legally complex.
Yeah, that was it became lawfare.
With that, I mean, that also comes into this kind of question of the witness, which you have it, comes up in many of your works, and the real kind of complexities about the position of witnesses and what is inadmissible before the law, such as in your works Once Removed, but then even the complexity and ambiguity, slippages and alterations of the testimonial process, as in the witness complex machine that you did. So
Yeah, I think there is a direct connection actually, because and it almost kind of like jumped out of the page at me, right? Because with the work of Once Removed and a lot of the work I was doing in Lebanon with Bassel Bishaheen, who is the kind of return of a soldier who died at 16 in the Shuf War in 1986. Sorry, in 1984, and in Lebanon. And so, I mean, what was interesting about that, or what my claim was with that work, was that what Bassel presented us with was a kind of new category of witness, right? And that's because, very much in line with someone like Walid Sadiq's work, who would say that there was witnesses who knew too much, right? Who knew too much to speak, and there's witnesses who participated who can't speak because of certain kind of conditions. They know too much. Then there is the kind of attack on on the ability to kind of know and learn, right? So the kind of position of anyone becoming a kind of expert witness, right, in the sense that of a kind of third party witness who would have developed a kind of knowledge. I mean, in the sense that they don't teach it in school, and there's no real historical consensus on what happened during the war. And so it seemed to me that what the situation demanded was a kind of new category of witnessing, and it was that Bassel was presenting that in some level. And so, to my surprise, when I say it jumped out at me the page, is when I was doing this, when I was writing the script. That's exactly the terms in which they describe Hernandez, a kind of new category of as a plaintiff, right? A new category of defendant, because it could open something, right? There was a potential for this to kind of, just like what Bassel is doing, to open something that has formerly been sealed, that all other paths to witnessing have not been kind of, have been all blocked. So there kind of need to be a demand for a new kind of path to witnessing, whether that is in a kind of legal forum or wherever it is. And it seemed to me that that's what they were terrified of in the Supreme Court. That actually that's why they couldn't find someone who murdered a child on a border just because he could. That's why they couldn't find him guilty, right? Because that he was potentially opening up a kind of new kind of category of witness, a new category of kind of defendant, and with it a whole new category of witnessing, right? Of people who were not American, who were not, who were thousands of miles away, but still were directly speaking to people who had murdered their family sitting in Arizona, or sorry, Nevada. I keep saying Arizona. It's Nevada. So yeah, I think that for me is an interesting line. That's sort of like, yeah, where those things can kind of open up.
I think too, it also it comes into this into the other work that you did, looking at the Nuremberg cases too, and these kind of slippages and alterations in the testimonial process as well. So this always kind of, as you said, this kind of challenging this category of witnessing, and then also taking it apart, really kind of showing the slippages and ambiguities and the problematics with something that's kind of taken to be, as you said, very kind of concrete and solid, in which decisions in court are kind of made that have massive consequences to them.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, particularly with that piece, how you were talking about kind of, the transformation that took place with translations.
Yeah, I think in some ways, though, that work, Witness Machine Complex, is more sort of faithful to the kind of conventional understanding of the witness. And I think what these other works are maybe proposing is something a bit more, a kind of opening, or a kind of necessity. And I think one, it can't exist without the other, right? It's sort of like I had to kind of get there through this process. And it's not that that one is sort of like an old work. It's not. It's I was making it at the same time I was making this, but still, and I made it after the work I did with Mercer. So so I think it's more faithful to a kind of witness that emerged through kind of Holocaust studies, right? That the idea of a kind of the sort of excess of the witness, what the witness can't say, right? This is all entirely indebted to people like Shoshana Fellman and Primo Levi, and I think that, you know, I think these other works, they're on a slightly different register. There's a sort of disaggregation of the witness in a way. It's becoming untethered to that literature in one way, and also to a kind of, also to its singularity, to the sort of individual in a way, and to, you know, to, yeah.
Yeah, so you can really kind of see an investigation of the witness transforming through your practice. Actually, if we look at these different positionalities and these different works, even in the piece that was looking at the kind of questions about hearing and leakages and contamination, in terms of like disputed utterances, you know, again, this these kind of leakages and contaminations of sound in those particular pieces. I mean, it is, you can see the witness all the way through. As you said, it's changing the witness who knows too much, the witness who is unadmissible in court, the witness who wasn't there, those who were throwing rocks but they weren't actually throwing rocks.
Exactly. No, and you know, it also goes back to, you know, something like Rubber Coated Steel, you know, where the only real witness that we should be listening to actually cannot speak, right? And wouldn't speak to that forum. And so I think it begins there, right, with the kind of shift about inaudibility, or thresholds of audibility. And sort of always trying to position myself at that threshold, right? Be it on the Haskell borderline that crosses the Haskell library, or in the kind of threshold of audibility in the kind of terms of silence, right? In the Saidnaya case, where it's just like really a sound that is just barely audible, right? So I think I've always found it important to sort of position myself at these thresholds. And that's very much indebted to my education with E.L. Weitzman all those years ago. And
I think with that on thresholds, because with Idania, I think that really kind of, you really showed how you know, the space of memory and testimonial, and how that kind of got conflated, because where you know, when you were discussing and describing kind of the sound of bread being distributed, and how that got kind of conflated in the imagination of the prisoners, and so forth. So I mean, that those kind of thresholds with memory and testimony and witness, and the complexity of the layering of those, that they're not as clear cut as we presume them to kind of be. And you really kind of take that apart in your work, and you show those kind of complexities around the audible and witnessing and thresholds.
Yeah, I think yeah, exactly. I think it's also you at that threshold you start to be able to sort of position yourself a little differently and to sort of get out of certain kinds of, you know, conventions also around the stories we tell and the way we sort of continually kind of retell them and recast people in the same way. And I think that's, of course, of great detriment. And I think we wouldn't need to find new ways to tell these stories should there not be a kind of crisis of representation in the way that we're kind of positioning ourselves as kind of storytellers. And yeah, but yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did
Yeah.
for sure. I was thinking possibly that I'm sure the audience would like to have a chance to ask you questions. We've been talking for about an hour ourselves. So I'd like to open up the opportunity for anyone in the audience who might like to ask you some questions. We did have, and I
Absolutely.
think,
Yeah, no, I can field some of those and sort of speak for the person, or if the person would like to speak, I'm happy to, you know, please turn on your mic and please proceed. But you know, tackling the Q&A, I did want to first say that during the conversation, there's been a really wonderful sort of commentary by Alyssa, who is, as Lawrence pointed out, the person who painted the backdrops, them and their team. So I don't know if Alyssa, did you want to maybe speak a little bit about some of your comments and some of your insight into working on the project? Or were you happy just to leave it as a comment? Oh no, I just wanted to see if you wanted to speak in voice.
You have to unmute.
You'd have to unmute yourself.
Ah. No, I think it's something like allow to talk.
Oh, Amna, is there a way we can do that?
I got it. I got it. Oh no, you did it. Yeah, cool.
Oh, there we're connecting. Are you there, Alyssa?
I am here.
There you go.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I think it's just going to let me do sound, but thank you. What an incredible opportunity. And this entire project was just phenomenal. And Lawrence, you're amazing. And the background of the piece is amazing. And the Haskell is amazing. And it was fascinating that, like you said, nobody who lives in Vermont, I've known Vermonters my whole life. I know a kid who grew up 20 kilometers from there. They've never heard of it. My Armenian cousins who had to flee and immigrate through Iran and then to Syria and then to Lebanon and then to Detroit and then to Boston, all of course knew where the Haskell was because they had cousins coming through Canada and had just been to a wedding reception there for my third removed cousin. So a couple years ago during the Trump regime. So yeah, apparently wedding receptions was kind of a big deal there. But it was interesting to listen to the process of you guys just getting your visas in order, I have to say. And us trying to find
not. Yeah.
The fabrics, the visas, the airplane tickets, the trucking riots. There were so many divisions that the pandemic brought that were so much more than just duct tape across the floor. It was madness.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
But,
No. We all felt. I couldn't believe when we shot the last piece of dialogue.
yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I was like, if that hard drive, I still didn't believe it until I had the hard drive. I was like, we actually made this film. We actually did it. Yeah.
No, and I mean, I think I was planning on driving it up myself, but ended up with pneumonia. So I'm sorry I could not drive. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. But it's such an important discussion. And while I had pneumonia, I printed out the entire Supreme Court brief about Haskell. And so I've always been accused of being a method scenic artist. And so like I also do paintings and stuff. And Tina, I've worked with some of your colleagues at NYU Abu Dhabi. I was in Berlin studying the Biennale in 2018. And so like it's like I like the idea just listening to your plight. I can imagine trying to come up with visualizations is always difficult being a sound analyst, you know. But your work is so greatly important, Lawrence. I think it's really important.
Thank you so much.
But
thank you.
And just I would just add to that, Elisa, sorry, that I think obviously that there was a lot of roadblocks, as you pointed out, in getting this project off the ground. And I don't know, Lawrence, if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you came about to choose Mehdi to be the narrator, because I know initially, you know, you wanted to be the narrator for this piece, but of course couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, so exactly. I mean, we're 1 hour in and we didn't say the name Mehdi Fleifel, which is, you know, remarkable having somebody seen this film and he's the main attraction. So yeah, I mean, I was also like kind of in a position. I mean, this might sound like one of those like homework excuses. I was kind of like coming up with this feeling like, do I really want to do another monologue of myself? Do I really want to put another film in the world where I'm talking and and you know, in a way I can justify that by saying, I mean, that is what I do, right? That's my instrument, right? The way I tell the story and the way I find my way through it is very particular, and that's what I've developed over time, and that's really what's been consistent through all the projects I've done in some ways. So I was already thinking like it'd be kind of great to work with an actor, especially on this one, because there was this remove. There wasn't like it wasn't as close as some of the others, and in the sense that the way I was kind of implicated within of it. So I was already kind of leaning somewhere, and then when the U.S. border told me no, yeah, we implemented it. And the three people I kind of like approached were all people who I've known for over a decade. So it really felt like I needed to be someone I knew really well, at least like known for so long. I mean, Mehdi, yeah, since 2008, I've known him. So it's really yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that it felt like it needed to be someone who could embody what I do in some way. So there would be some of that kind of craft in there that I've built over the last years. And I think Mehdi just did an amazing job. And I think people who know the other work and see him, they're like, it is this kind of parallel world feeling, right? And Mehdi said himself that he wants like Bond, he wants like he wants the contract for the next 3 films to play the private ear. So, you know, we'll see if that goes through. I have to speak to the studio, the bosses. But no, I think he did an amazing job at sort of making that strange, uncanny, and he really worked on that kind of uncanny space where it's a film by me, it looks like a film by me, but it's not me. And you know, I think he was playing at that, and being that it's the 45th parallel, and being that it's trying to continually kind of evoke these kind of parallel worlds, I think that was really, it ended up being one of the strongest things about it. And so yeah, I'm so glad that worked out that way. As long as eventually I can get a US visa, it will be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Let's hope for that. I just wanted to say quickly, Tina, I know that initially at the beginning of this conversation, you had said that you have a bad back right now. So please don't feel like you need to stay. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm enjoying the conversation, Lawrence. We should have let's see who all your private eyes are going to be. Who'll be like watching the bonds come out for each sequence. That's going to be intriguing. If Matt is doing the next two films, then who will it be afterwards?
Yeah, exactly. You gotta keep getting, younger, more handsome. I think it's the way it goes. No?
More athletic.
As we age, as we all age. Yeah.
We also have a question in the Q&A. This is from someone who is anonymous, but they say, thank you for this thoughtful talk. I'm curious if you connected with Sergio Hernandez's family as part of this project, and if so, what was that like? I ask because I'm interested in how we navigate the line between the personal, intimate, and the global in creative projects such as this.
No, I didn't connect with the family. I didn't feel like I had business connecting with the family or dragging them through this for something like this. It's they'd been through it. Through several cases of the through 3-4 appeals, through the sort of raising through the heights of the Supreme Court, and it would feel, I think, frivolous to ask them to be part of something like this. So I mean, that's the really short answer. But yeah, also, what I said before about the sort of disaggregation of the witness, right? What was interesting for me is that it was really this, it's about, of course, Sergio Hernandez, but it's also about all these other cross-border killings, right? And that the idea that this person could stand in for all these other souls and voices and people who have had their life taken by the US and its kind of brutal foreign policy or warfare. I don't know what to call it, just sort of imperialism. All those people who've lost their lives, including the ones that maybe Amna was evoking in the kind of land acknowledgement. So I think, it's just to say that I was trying to sort of disaggregate, in fact, maybe the opposite of what you're describing, from the sort of personal and the individual story to something a bit more of a kind of network, where the witness become a kind of network or a nexus.
Yeah, because in the film too, you speak about all the lives of people who've been affected by drone strikes, the murdered, both collateral damage, but also who were targeted, right?
And there's a direct connection, right? I mean, I hope that I made that clear. It's not just like they're not analogous because of whatever they are. There's a direct connection. So that case started to implicate the drone killings of the drone strike, and we're entering, of course, now the second wave of drone warfare of unmanned aerial vehicles in its kind of second big push.
By the way, do we know if there's any further challenges to these laws? I mean, I know that there has to be cases coming up through Supreme Court, in terms of drone strikes. And what's happened, but I don't know if you've been following what else.
Well, they can't. I mean, this is a precedent now. I mean, they couldn't before. I mean, there's all these kinds of precedents where at some point foreign people have been allowed to take the US to court, and there was 2 cases that were evoked through the Supreme Court when they were deciding on this case. One of them was a case of a Biafran sponsored, basically a kind of US company sponsoring kind of violence in Biafra. I think it was Shell. And another precedent that's called Bivens, which is very important, which is about a search and seizure of a non-US national. And I would have to sort of brush up on that to sort of be more specific, but essentially these precedents, they do exist and they come in and out and whatever, but this court, and I think this is the big problem of sort of making fun of someone like Brett Kavanaugh. This is what the big lesson I learned doing this research, is that this person is extremely clever, right? You know how they tried to paint him as this guy, and he's like saying, "I like beer," and he kind of came out, and there was this sort of like clown. They made him a clown, right? And this is like a gift to this guy to be a clown, because you see him in this court, you see what he does. It's like, I mean, from the perspective of technique, right? He's like, we may hate the music of some, I'm not going to do that comparison. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that from the perspective of technique, it's very impressive. And you saw just how far ahead he is of everyone else in kind of achieving his agenda. And now who has the sort of backing of all these other conservatives on that bench. So I think it is, it is also a story about that, the sort of, and look where we are now with Roe v. Wade. I mean, just to, it's, so I think there is that kind of sub-narrative, and that's one that also kind of started with Walled and Walled, and just kind of like, the film before this from 2018. And sort of, I think it's an important thing to sort of tell that story as it's happening, that kind of hardening, that the sort of hardening of that space towards a kind of quite extreme kind of conservatism and right-wing sort of, whatever. Liberal status quo, I don't know what to call it, but yeah, it's really like, I think it was also occurred to me that there was something very much happening that I wasn't yet able to process, but it seemed that it was there and it was coming out already quite fast, and it felt like there needed to be this sort of response to it in a way. Yeah.
So I have a couple of other questions here in the chat. This one is from Colette La Liberté. Thank you for your generous presentation and for the film. I just wanted to say that I grew up in Stansted. The library and the Opera House were the first library I used in the first shows I was given to see as a child and teenager. The site, even for us, remains an incongruous place and speaks of how borders are arbitrary. This is more of a statement, but it's great that we have somebody.
Incredible. Thank you, Colette. Yeah, thank you. Well, that's really great to hear, actually, that it was opening doors for you also, coming from that place. So that's great. I'm sure you're familiar with that moose's head. Just behind me.
And this one is from Alyssa. Again, she just says, thank you for the forum and discussion. I do not see that there is a nonprofit organization for drone strike victims, ? Only partners and medical, ? Is it too taboo, too corporate in terms of the financial implication?
No, I mean, there's incredible work done for drone strike victims. I mean, I think it's, I'm going to mess this up, but one of the main, I think am I going crazy? Is Stansted a big Ivy League university, something like that? Right? No, it's not called Stansted. What's it called? Stanford. Sorry, Stanford. Yeah, so Stanford have done a huge this thing under the drone thing where they interviewed so many people and did a huge, big analysis. I mean, yeah, there's tons of organizations who are working with that. But I think what we're talking about is the sort of internal legal debates that are happening on a kind of national level in the US, not about sort of non-governmental organizations kind of producing advocacy. Of course, advocacy exists, but here it was where it kind of buttressed against like real sort of legal decision making, and it really came very close. I mean, one vote, and it would have, changed. So yeah, that's.
So just quickly, Amna did sort of say that it's called the Stanford Clinic. So there is a place, I think, that does that work. And I think with the final question, I think we can end on is I think this is a good one from Alyssa again. As artists, how can we be most useful to support, in your opinion? Are there ways to engage and be useful? Lawrence.
Oh shit. I mean, I don't know. It's a hard question. I don't know if I set out to be useful or if it's use value that I think is important. I think it's reactive and responsive to the ways, like I said before, that stories are being told. I think, you know, it's also like, I don't really like even the word artist. That's also why I choose private ear, because it's sort of like, I just feel it's more specific, and I don't really care that much if something is art or not. I don't feel very precious about it. I just think that it is a necessity to sort of mobilize and experiment with the tools we have to sort of tell stories, because they're so sedimented in forums such as the news or in law courts or in, you know, the ways are very kind of hardened there. And I think it's really important to have spaces where we can sort of experiment with the sort of aestheticization or the kind of making people sensible to such crimes or such criminal acts. For me, that's important. I mean, that's why I do it. I don't know if it's important, but it's what I'm doing. And so I hope that makes sense. It's sort of like, yeah.
I really think
yeah.
you kind of show us our contemporary world and the kind of way in which law and institutions and are so imbricated in each other, and really all the kind of complexities of our kind of positions as citizens, and the sense of us also kind of often kind of feeling powerless, and there's the complexity of what's going on, but you really kind of shed kind of light on that in ways that are really making us see the world differently, and the way it's kind of the way these complexities are kind of all imbricated within each other. You really kind of, through all your different projects, really kind of bring that so much to the foreground in the kind of different mediums and tools that you use. And yeah, I'm not really saying this very well, but our contemporary condition is just so, I don't know, it's just so layered and complex to grasp. And, you know, as you said, through kind of the news and through media and through these major, all these massive kind of ways in which information is reaching us, and, you know, decision making in the law and so forth. And you just kind of really begin to kind of look at all those fissures and cracks and take that apart through the way in which your work focuses on all these different cases that you work with.
So. Yeah, I would agree with you, Tina. And just to add to kind of say, I think in response to that question, what Lawrence's work does is that there is, you know, we're inundated with storytelling from the state, from the media, and it's so seductive, and it you know, it's so misleading, and it doesn't say the things that need to be said. And I think what you offer is a counter narrative through your storytelling. It's a very strong counter narrative, and they're told so elegantly and so beautifully that you know, it's just a sort of like eye-opening experience watching it. Oh, yeah. Right, that's of course that is
that's
what's
what I was
happening.
trying to get to, that it really kind of just opens your, you know, it's like it's something that's been kind of under your skin all the time, and you know you're going to be, you know, you're going to be, your eyes are being held over, and it's like, yes, these are where all the dots connect up.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Tina, so much for your essay and for this conversation. And Lawrence, thank you so much for your work, always.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, for your work. It's always so inspiring.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for that fantastic essay, and for making the time today despite your back troubles. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's take it.
Hello.